It's quiet right now. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty, but the kind that feels honest. The kind that only shows up when the day is finally over and there's nothing left to distract you from yourself. No notifications asking for your attention, no conversations to perform, no roles to play. Just this moment, exactly as it is. You didn't plan to be here. This moment arrived on its own. Maybe you were trying to sleep. Maybe you were scrolling without really looking. Maybe you were just searching for something that felt a little less heavy than what was inside your mind. Nights have a way of doing that. They soften the noise outside, but they also turn up the volume of what's been waiting underneath. During the day, it's easier to move forward without looking too closely. There's always something to do, something to respond to, something that needs your energy. But at night, there's space. And in that space, questions begin to surface. Not loud questions, not dramatic ones, and just quiet questions that don't seem to go away. Questions about things that didn't turn out the way you expected. About moments that ended without explanation. About choices you still replay, even when you know replaying them doesn't help. If you notice those thoughts right now, you don't need to push them away. You don't need to follow them either. Just notice that they're here, and that you're still here too. Nothing is being asked of you in this moment. You don't need to understand your life tonight. You don't need to make sense of what happened, or why it happened, or what it says about you. For now, this is simply a place to pause. A place where you don't have to arrive at any conclusion. Where you don't have to be productive with your pain. Where you don't have to turn your experience into a lesson or a story that makes sense. Let the night carry the weight for a while. Let the questions rest without answers. And as you listen, allow yourself to stay exactly where you are. Without moving ahead, without going back, without needing this moment to become anything more than it already is. As you stay here for a moment longer, notice that nothing has changed around you, and yet something has already begun to slow down. Not because you tried to relax, not because you did anything correctly, but because you stopped pushing yourself forward for a few seconds. Sometimes, that's all the system needs to begin settling on its own. You don't need to check your breathing. You don't need to adjust your posture. Whatever position you're in right now is already enough. The body knows how to rest when it's given permission, and permission doesn't come from effort. It comes from safety. Notice the simple fact that you are being supported by the surface beneath you, by the quiet of the room, by the steady pull of gravity that doesn't ask anything from you. Even if your thoughts are still moving, even if your mind hasn't slowed yet, there is a part of you that is already held. If your attention drifts, let it drift. If it comes back, let it come back. There's no need to guide it anywhere specific. Tonight isn't about focus. It's about allowing your system to step out of constant readiness. So much of your day requires you to be alert, to notice what might go wrong, to anticipate what others expect from you. Over time, that alertness becomes a habit. The body stays tense even when there's no immediate threat. Not because it wants to, but because it learned that staying ready once mattered. You don't have to undo that learning tonight. You don't have to convince yourself that everything is safe. Just notice that in this moment, nothing is being demanded of you. There's no problem waiting for an answer. No decision that needs to be made before you can rest. If you notice tightness somewhere, you don't need to release it completely. Just allow a small softening. A subtle permission for the muscles to do a little less work. The shoulders don't need to hold anything right now. The jaw doesn't need to stay ready. Even a slight easing is enough. Thoughts may still come and go. Plans, memories, conversations that replay without warning. You don't need to stop them. You don't need to follow them either. Imagine them as sounds in the distance, present but not urgent. They can exist without pulling you along. There is a difference between being aware and being involved.
Tonight, awareness is enough. You don't need to engage with everything that appears in your mind. You can let your attention rest in the background, listening without effort. If you feel yourself growing heavier, that's not a loss of control. It's a sign that your system is recognizing a pause. And if you don't feel that yet,
that's okay too. Nothing is failing. Nothing needs to happen at a certain pace. You are allowed to be exactly where you are in this process. Alert or tired, restless or calm. The night does not rush you. It does not compare you to anyone else. It simply stays. For now, let yourself remain here, without adjusting, without fixing, without preparing for what comes next. There will be time for understanding later. There will be space for answers another day. This moment is only asking you to stay, and to let the body remember that it doesn't have to carry everything at once. As you continue listening, you may notice that the mind still wants to do something. It might look for the next idea, the next sentence, the next thing to understand. That tendency is familiar. It comes from spending so much time needing to stay one step ahead of what's coming. You don't need to stop that habit. Just notice it. The mind has learned to stay active because,
at some point, being prepared felt necessary. That readiness helped you navigate uncertainty, expectations, and moments that felt unpredictable. It served a purpose, and because it once mattered, it doesn't disappear simply because you ask it to. Tonight, there's no need to turn that activity into a problem. You're not trying to silence your thoughts.
You're allowing them to exist without treating them as instructions. They can move through the background while you remain here, listening without following every direction they point toward. Notice how often the body reacts before the mind finishes a thought. A slight tightening, a subtle holding, a readiness that shows up automatically. These responses don't mean you're anxious or broken. They mean your system has learned to stay alert in a world that often required it. Right now, you don't need to convince your body that it's safe. Safety is not an argument, it's an experience. And sometimes, the simplest experience of safety
is the absence of demand. No one is asking anything from you in this moment. There is nothing you need to respond to, nothing you need to anticipate. If it feels difficult to let go of control, that's understandable. Control often feels like protection, but rest doesn't require surrendering everything at once. It begins with allowing one small area to soften. Perhaps the hands can rest without gripping. Perhaps the eyes can remain unfocused. Perhaps the breath can continue without being watched. There's no correct way to do this. There's only the way your system responds when it's not being managed. Some nights, that response is a deep sense of calm. Other nights, it's simply less tension than before. Both are enough. You may notice moments where your attention drifts completely, where the words become distant or blurred. That's not something to correct.
That's your system beginning to step out of constant engagement. And if your attention returns, that's fine too. There's no right amount of drifting. The body understands repetition better than instruction. It learns through consistency, through being allowed to experience the same gentle conditions again and again. This steady tone, this unhurried pace, this lack of urgency. Over time, that sameness becomes familiar, and familiarity is one of the foundations of rest. You don't need to hold on to every sentence. You don't need to remember what was said a moment ago. The meaning is not in the words themselves. It's in the rhythm, in the permission they carry, in the absence of pressure to respond.
If there is a part of you that stays watchful, that remains slightly on guard, let it stay. You don't need to push it away. That part learned its role carefully. It can remain present while the rest of you rests. Nothing needs to be excluded. As the minutes pass, you may feel a subtle shift. Not dramatic, not obvious. Just a slight easing in how much effort it takes to be here. That easing doesn't come from trying. It comes from no longer resisting the moment. For now, let yourself remain in this gentle in-between space. Not asleep, not fully alert, just here. Supported, unrushed, without needing this moment to lead anywhere else. As you remain here, you may begin to notice that time feels a little less defined. The minutes don't need to be counted. There's no sense of moving towards something. This moment isn't a step in a process. It's simply a pause that doesn't need a purpose. Your body doesn't require instructions to rest. It only needs enough space to stop performing. When nothing is expected of it,
It begins to return to a rhythm that feels more natural. Not perfect, not completely still, just quieter than before. If you notice sensations shifting, warmth, heaviness, lightness, or even restlessness, allow them to be present without interpretation. There's no need to label what's happening. The nervous system doesn't respond to labels. It responds to consistency, to gentleness, to the absence of urgency. You may notice that the urge to understand begins to soften. The mind doesn't need to solve anything right now. It doesn't need to reach a conclusion or make sense of what you've been feeling. Understanding can wait. Tonight is not asking for insight. It's asking for permission to slow down. There is a quiet relief that comes when you stop monitoring yourself. When you stop checking whether you're calm enough, relaxed enough, present enough. That constant checking takes effort, even when it's subtle. Letting go of it doesn't mean giving up awareness. It means allowing awareness to exist without supervision. If your thoughts become fragmented or unclear, that's not a problem. If the words blend together, that's not a failure. Your system doesn't need clarity to rest. It only needs to know that nothing is about to demand a response. Notice how the space around the words feels, the pauses between sentences, the steady, unhurried pace. That rhythm is intentional. It mirrors the pace your body begins to adopt when it no longer needs to stay alert. You don't need to hold yourself together right now. You don't need to stay sharp. You don't need to keep track of where you are in the listening. You can allow the edges of attention to soften, knowing that nothing important will be missed. If sleep begins to approach, you don't need to resist it. And if it doesn't, that's fine too. Rest doesn't always look like sleep. Sometimes it's simply a reduction in effort, a moment where the system stops bracing itself for what might come next. As this part of the night continues, Let yourself stay with the simplicity of being supported. Supported by the surface beneath you. Supported by the quiet. Supported by the fact that, in this moment, there is nothing you need to become. There will be space later to reflect, to understand, to look more closely at
the patterns you've carried. But that exploration doesn't need to happen before rest. It can wait until the body feels less guarded, less defended. For now, remain here, in this slower rhythm, not trying to arrive anywhere, not preparing for the next thought, just allowing the system to stay in this state of reduced effort, where nothing is required and nothing is missing. As you continue resting in this quieter space, it may become easier to notice how often the mind returns to a familiar conclusion. Not always in words, sometimes just as a feeling. A subtle sense that something about you should be different by now. That if things were truly okay, you wouldn't still feel this way. This belief doesn't usually announce itself clearly. It shows up in small moments.
In the way you question your reactions, in the way you compare your inner experience to what others seem to manage, in the way discomfort quickly turns into self-evaluation. Without realizing it, many people grow up learning to see their feelings as problems. Sadness becomes something to fix. Anxiety becomes something to overcome.
Confusion becomes a sign of failure. Over time, the inner world starts to feel like a series of obstacles rather than a natural response to life. But the truth is quieter than that. What you feel is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It is evidence that you have been affected. Affected by relationships, by expectations, by moments that asked more than you had available at the time. Your system did not choose its patterns randomly. It learned them through experience. It learned when to stay alert, when to hold back, when to prepare for disappointment. These responses didn't form because you misunderstood life. They formed because at some point, they helped you navigate it. There is a difference between something being uncomfortable and something being wrong. Discomfort simply means you're in contact with something that matters, something that touched you, something that left an imprint. Wrongness is a judgment added afterward, often learned from environments that didn't have space for complexity. Many people carry the belief that they should be calmer, more confident, more certain by now. That time alone should have resolved everything. But time doesn't heal by itself. What heals is safety, understanding, and the absence of constant self-pressure. When those conditions aren't present, the system adapts. It stays vigilant. It replays. It scans for what might go wrong next. None of that is a flaw. It's an attempt to protect what feels vulnerable. Tonight, there is no need to correct those patterns. Correction assumes something is broken.
Understanding assumes something has a story, and stories don't need to be erased to be honored. If you notice an inner voice that evaluates everything you feel, telling you that you should be further along or doing better, see if you can recognize it as a learned response rather than a truth. That voice often developed in places where emotions were inconvenient or misunderstood. It doesn't need to be silenced. It doesn't need to be argued with. It only needs to be seen for what it is: an old strategy trying to keep you safe in a world that once felt unpredictable. Nothing about your experience disqualifies you from rest. You don't need to earn calm by being better. You don't need to justify your exhaustion. You don't need to resolve your history before you're allowed peace. There is relief in realizing that you are not a problem to be solved. You are a system that learned how to survive. And survival strategies don't disappear just because life changes. They soften when they are no longer treated as enemies. As you sit with this idea, you don't need to force yourself to believe it. Belief is not required. Simply allowing the possibility that nothing is wrong with you is enough for now. That possibility alone can reduce the effort you've been carrying.
Let that thought rest in the background without grabbing onto it. There's no need to repeat it, no need to make it convincing. Just let it exist alongside the breath, alongside the quiet, alongside the simple act of being here. This is not a conclusion. It's an opening. And as the night continues, there will be space to look more closely at how this belief formed, how it shaped you, and how it can gradually loosen without force. For now, remain in this gentle awareness. Nothing to fix, nothing to improve. Just the understanding that what you feel makes sense, and that sense does not need to be explained tonight. As that understanding lingers quietly in the background, it may become easier to notice where the belief that something is wrong with you first began to take shape. Not as a single moment, but as a gradual accumulation of experiences. Small signals received over time, reactions observed, patterns learned without being consciously chosen. Often, this belief doesn't come from anything you did wrong. It forms when your inner experience wasn't fully met, when there wasn't enough space for uncertainty, when emotions needed to be managed, minimized, or explained away in order to keep things moving. In those environments, it's natural to conclude that the problem must be internal. You may have learned, quietly, that feeling too much created distance, that needing reassurance caused inconvenience. That confusion was something to outgrow quickly. None of this was taught explicitly. It was absorbed through tone, timing, and what was allowed to exist without disruption. Over time, the system adapts. It begins to monitor itself, to anticipate how much feeling is acceptable, to shape responses before they're fully felt. This self-monitoring can look like maturity from the outside, but internally, it often carries a sense of constant adjustment. This is not a personal failure. It's a relational response. The nervous system is shaped not only by events, but by the quality of presence around those events. When understanding was limited or inconsistent, the system learned to rely more heavily on control. Control can feel like stability. It can feel like responsibility, but it often comes with an underlying tension, a quiet vigilance that stays active even when nothing immediate is happening. That vigilance doesn't mean you're anxious by nature. It means your system learned that staying alert reduced uncertainty. In many cases, the belief that something is wrong with you emerges not from harm, but from absence. The absence of enough time, enough patience, enough attunement. When those elements are missing, the system fills in the gap with self-interpretation. Children, especially, are remarkably good at making sense of their environment by turning it inward. If support is inconsistent, the conclusion is rarely that the environment is limited. It's more often that something about the self is too much or not enough. Those early conclusions don't disappear just because you grow older. They remain as background assumptions, quiet filters through which experience is interpreted. You may not hear them clearly, but you feel their influence in moments of doubt, hesitation, or self-questioning. It's important to recognize that these beliefs were never meant to harm you. They were attempts to maintain connection, predict outcomes, and reduce risk. They were creative responses to limited information. And creativity, even when it creates tension later on, deserves respect rather than judgment. You don't need to relive the past to understand this. You don't need to remember specific events. The body remembers patterns, even when the mind doesn't recall details. That memory shows up in how quickly you brace yourself, how carefully you navigate situations, how easily you turn inward when something feels off. Tonight, there is no need to correct those responses.
Correction implies error. Recognition implies understanding. And understanding allows the system to feel less alone with its strategies. As you listen, you may notice moments where something resonates without explanation. A sense of recognition rather than clarity. That's enough. Insight doesn't need to be sharp to be real. Sometimes,
it's simply a soft acknowledgement that says, "This makes sense." Nothing here is asking you to change who you are. This is not about letting go of vigilance before you're ready. It's about seeing that what you've been carrying didn't come from nowhere. It had reasons. It had context, and it formed in response to conditions that no longer need to define you. As this awareness settles, there's no need to hold on to it tightly. You can let it remain gentle, incomplete, unfinished. The system doesn't need a full story to begin softening. It only needs permission to stop blaming itself. For now, stay with this quieter recognition, not analyzing, not concluding, just allowing the possibility that the belief you've carried was shaped by circumstance, not by defect. And that possibility, even on its own, can begin to loosen what once felt fixed as that recognition settles a little more deeply. You may begin to notice how often your attention turns inward with the intention to correct. Not in a harsh way, not always with criticism, but with a quiet assumption that something needs adjusting before you can truly rest. This habit can feel responsible. It can feel mature. It often sounds like self-awareness. But underneath it, there is frequently a subtle message that says, once I figure this out, once I fix this part of myself, then I'll be allowed to feel at ease. Over time, the inner world becomes a project. Emotions are examined, reactions are measured. Every uncomfortable feeling is treated as a signal that more work is needed. And without realizing it, rest is postponed until improvement is achieved. This doesn't happen because you're too focused on yourself. It happens because you learned that ease came after adjustment. That being accepted required effort. That staying connected meant staying vigilant. But the nervous system doesn't rest because it has been perfected. It rests when it no longer feels under evaluation. When you treat yourself like a problem to be solved, even gently, the body stays slightly braced. It waits for the next instruction, the next insight, the next realization that will finally make things right, and that waiting itself becomes a form of tension. There is a difference between curiosity and correction. Curiosity allows experience to unfold. Correction interrupts it. Tonight, we are not moving away from awareness. We are moving away from the need to intervene. You may notice moments where the mind wants to label what you're feeling, to decide whether it's healthy or productive, or something that should have passed by now. See if you can let those labels remain unfinished. You don't need to finalize your understanding of yourself in this moment. Nothing here requires a conclusion. The idea that you must become different before you can rest is a belief, not a law. And like many beliefs, it formed quietly, without your consent. It was shaped by repetition, by expectations that were never spoken out loud, by moments when being yourself felt conditional. Releasing that belief doesn't mean rejecting growth. It means recognizing that growth doesn't begin with
Self-rejection. It begins when pressure is reduced enough for the system to breathe. If you feel resistance to this idea, that's understandable. Letting go of self-correction can feel unsafe at first. Improvement can feel like control, and control can feel like protection. There's no need to force yourself to drop it all at once.
For now, you can simply notice how much effort goes into managing yourself, how often you monitor your tone, your reactions, your thoughts. Notice that effort without trying to remove it. Awareness alone begins to change the relationship. Pause. You don't need to trust that everything will work out. You don't need to believe that you're exactly where you should be. Those ideas can feel distant or unrealistic. All that's being offered here is the possibility of standing down from the role of constant self-manager, even briefly. In this moment, you are not required to improve. You are not required to understand yourself better.
You are not required to make progress. You are allowed to exist without commentary. That permission may feel unfamiliar. It may feel incomplete. That's okay. It doesn't need to feel convincing to be effective. The nervous system responds to the absence of demand more than it responds to reassurance. As you continue listening,
allow yourself to stay with this reduced effort, not trying to become calmer, not trying to feel better, just allowing the experience of not fixing anything. There will be time later to reflect, to learn, to change. But that time doesn't need to come before rest. Rest is not a reward for improvement. It's a condition that makes improvement possible. For now, remain in this simpler relationship with yourself, one where nothing is being corrected, nothing is being adjusted, and nothing is being judged. Just the quiet experience of being here, without turning yourself into a task. As that sense of reduced effort settles in, you may begin to notice something subtle. When you're no longer trying to correct yourself, the body doesn't rush to replace that effort with something else. It simply slows, as if it has been waiting for permission to stop holding its breath. Rest, in this way, is not something you achieve. It's something that happens when interference eases, when the constant checking, adjusting, and refining steps aside. Even briefly, the system remembers a quieter rhythm that doesn't require supervision. You might notice a part of you that hesitates here, a quiet concern that says, if I rest without fixing anything, things might fall apart. That concern is understandable. It learned its logic in moments when staying alert felt like the only way to maintain stability. It doesn't need to be argued with. It only needs to be acknowledged. Rest does not mean ignoring what matters. It means trusting that what matters does not need your constant effort to exist. Life continues to move even when you are not managing it moment by moment. If you find yourself waiting for a sense of relief before allowing rest, notice that pattern gently. Relief is not a prerequisite. Rest can come first. Sometimes the body needs to experience ease before the mind believes it's allowed.
You don't need to be calm to rest. You don't need to be clear. You don't need to feel resolved. You can rest while still carrying uncertainty. You can rest while questions remain open. Rest does not require closure. The idea that rest must be earned is deeply embedded in many lives. Earned through productivity,
through insight, through self-improvement. But the nervous system does not operate on merit. It responds to conditions. And one of the most powerful conditions for rest is the absence of evaluation. Notice how it feels when nothing about this moment is being measured. Not your progress, not your awareness, not your emotional state. Just the simple experience of being supported without commentary. If sleep begins to approach, let it. If it doesn't, that's fine too. Rest is not a single state. It moves, it fluctuates. Sometimes it shows up as heaviness, sometimes as softness, sometimes as a quiet neutrality that doesn't demand attention. There is no correct depth to reach, no ideal feeling to aim for. The body will take what it needs from this moment without instruction. Your role is not to guide it, but to allow it space. You may notice that when effort drops, emotions become less sharp. Not because they've been resolved, but because they're no longer being pressed against. Pressure amplifies sensation. Release allows it to spread out and soften. Nothing here requires a breakthrough. Nothing is asking for transformation. This is not a turning point. It's simply a place where the system is allowed to stop bracing for what comes next. As you remain here, you may feel less compelled to track time, less interested in where this is going. That's not disengagement, that's rest. Engagement relaxes when it no longer needs to be maintained. You don't need to hold on to this state. You don't need to make it last. Rest doesn't respond well to grasping. It arrives when there is room and leaves when it's no longer needed.
Both movements are natural. For now, let yourself stay in this uncorrected space. No fixing, no refining, no preparation. Just the experience of being present without being managed. There will be moments later when effort returns, when thinking resumes, when attention sharpens again. That's not a failure.
That's how systems move. But right now, effort can remain low, and nothing important will be lost. Allow this simpler rhythm to continue, without asking anything of it. Just let it exist, quietly, alongside you, as the night carries on. As this quieter rhythm continues, you may begin to notice how often judgment tries to return, almost automatically. Not always as harsh criticism, but as subtle commentary. A quiet measuring of how you're doing, whether this state is deep enough, whether you're resting correctly, and whether you should be feeling something different by now. Judgment doesn't usually announce itself loudly. It slips in gently, disguised as concern, as responsibility, as the desire to make sure you're not falling behind. And because it feels familiar, it often goes unquestioned. But living under constant evaluation, even mild evaluation, keeps the system slightly tense. It creates the sense that something about this moment needs approval before it can fully unfold. That approval rarely arrives, because judgment always looks for the next thing to assess. You may notice how quickly experience turns into commentary. A sensation appears, and immediately the mind labels it good, bad, comfortable, uncomfortable, progress, setback. This labeling happens so fast that it can feel inseparable from the experience itself. Tonight, you don't need to stop that process. You don't need to correct it. Just begin to notice the difference between what you feel and what you say about what you feel. Sensation is immediate. Judgment is added. When judgment softens, even slightly, experience becomes simpler, not easier, but less layered. There is less friction between what is happening and what you think should be happening.
That reduction in friction allows the system to conserve energy. You are not required to relate to yourself through constant assessment. That mode of relating developed for a reason.
It often helped you adapt, meet expectations, and/or avoid mistakes. It doesn't need to be eliminated. It only needs to loosen its hold. Living without self-judgment doesn't mean living without standards or values. It means allowing your inner experience to exist without turning it into a verdict about who you are. Feelings can pass through without defining you. If you notice discomfort, you don't need to ask whether it's justified. If you notice ease, you don't need to question whether it will last. Experience can be allowed to move without commentary trailing behind it. This way of being may feel unfamiliar. Judgment often feels like engagement, like staying involved. Letting go of it can feel like stepping back. But stepping back doesn't mean disengaging from life. It means giving life room to move without being constantly interpreted. Notice how the body responds when judgment drops. Even for a moment, there may be a subtle release, a small softening, a sense of having a little more space inside. These changes are not dramatic, but they are meaningful. You don't need to maintain this state. You don't need to hold on to it. Judgment will return at times. That's natural. What matters is recognizing that it's not the only way to relate to yourself. For now, you can let experience unfold without assigning it a value. Just this sensation, just this breath, just this moment. Nothing more needs to be said about it. As the night continues, this absence of judgment allows a deeper settling. Not because everything is resolved, but because nothing is being evaluated. The system can rest when it's no longer under review. You are allowed to exist without commentary. You are allowed to feel without explanation. You are allowed to rest without assessment. None of this requires effort. It only requires the willingness to not add anything extra. Let this way of being remain gentle and incomplete. There is no need to turn it into an identity or a rule. It's simply another way of relating to your experience, one that places less weight on every moment. As you continue listening, allow this softer relationship to yourself to remain in the background. Not something to practice, just something that is available, quietly, whenever judgment loosens its grip. As everything you've heard begins to settle, there's no need to hold on to any particular idea. Nothing here needs to be remembered precisely. Nothing needs to be carried forward as a belief or a rule. What matters is not the wording, but the quiet shift that may already be happening beneath it. Sometimes understanding arrives not as clarity, but as a softening. A sense that the effort you've been carrying doesn't need to stay so tight, that the inner world doesn't need to be managed with such intensity. This kind of understanding doesn't ask to be articulated. It simply changes the way the system holds itself. You may notice that thoughts come more slowly now, or that they feel less urgent. If they do, allow that pace to remain. And if they don't, that's fine too. Nothing here depends on reaching a particular state. There is no conclusion to arrive at tonight. The idea that nothing is wrong with you doesn't need to be proven. It doesn't need to replace any other belief. It can exist quietly, in the background, without being defended. When pressure eases, even slightly, the body often responds first. A deeper exhale, a sense of weight settling downward, a lessening of the constant internal scan. These changes don't require attention. They happen on their own when effort reduces. You don't need to check whether this is working.
You don't need to measure how relaxed you are. The system doesn't respond to monitoring. It responds to space. If parts of you are still active, still watchful, let them remain. They don't need to disappear for rest to happen. They can coexist with this quieter layer underneath. Nothing needs to be excluded. This is not about becoming someone different. It's about allowing yourself to be experienced without constant interpretation. Experience can move through you without being turned into a statement about who you are. As the night continues, there may be moments where awareness fades in and out, where words blur, where attention drifts without direction. That's not something to correct. It's simply the nervous system moving toward a lower level of effort. There is no need to follow the mind wherever it goes. There is no need to stay with every sentence. You can allow yourself to listen loosely, knowing that nothing essential will be missed. Rest does not require completion. It does not require insight. It does not require understanding. It only requires the absence of pressure to be anywhere else. For now, let everything remain unfinished, unresolved, open. Life does not need to make sense in order for the body to rest. Meaning can wait. Answers can wait. Even understanding can wait. Allow this quiet to continue without asking anything of it. Let it remain gentle, undefined, and unowned. Just a softer way of being here, without effort, without correction, without judgment. As the night carries on, you don't need to do anything with what has been said.
You can let it fade into the background, like sound blending into silence. The system will take what it needs and leave the rest. As this quieter awareness continues, it may become easier to notice how much of your life has been spent moving forward without ever really stopping to check in. Not because you didn't care, but because stopping often didn't feel practical. There was always something next, another responsibility, another expectation, another version of yourself you were trying to keep up with.
Many people live this way for years, functioning well enough on the outside while quietly feeling disconnected on the inside. Days fill up, schedules stay full, messages get answered, and yet, beneath all of that motion, there can be a persistent sense that something is missing, even when everything appears to be in place.
This feeling doesn't usually announce itself clearly. It shows up in small moments, in the quiet after a long day, in the way exhaustion lingers even after rest, in the sense that you're always catching up, but never quite arriving. You may recognize this pattern in how quickly life moves past you. Weeks blur together. Milestones pass without being fully felt. Conversations happen, but something about them feels distant, as if part of you is always somewhere else. This isn't because you're ungrateful. It's not because you don't appreciate what you have. It's because modern life often rewards momentum more than presence. Being busy is praised. Being available is expected. Slowing down can feel like falling behind. Over time, the system adapts to this pace. It learns to stay active even when it's tired. It learns to keep going, even when it's no longer connected to why. That adaptation looks like strength, but it often comes with a quiet cost. You may notice how difficult it is to simply sit without distraction. How quickly the mind reaches for something to fill the space. Noise, content, stimulation. Not because you enjoy it, but because stillness brings up questions you haven't had time to answer. In those moments, the sense of disconnection becomes clearer. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a subtle feeling of being slightly removed from your own experience, as if you're living your life from a step behind. This experience is more common than most people admit. It doesn't mean you've chosen the wrong path. It doesn't mean you've missed your chance. It means you've been responding to a world that rarely encourages pause. Tonight, there's no need to judge that pattern. You don't need to label it as burnout or dissatisfaction. Naming it isn't required. Simply noticing it is enough. As you listen, you may find yourself recognizing moments from your own life, not specific events and wounds,
but familiar feelings, the quiet tiredness, the sense of always being on, the difficulty remembering the last time you felt truly present without effort. This recognition isn't meant to push you toward change. It's not an invitation to rethink your entire life. It's simply a mirror, held gently, without asking anything in return. For now, allow this reflection to exist without analysis. You don't need to decide what it means. You don't need to connect it to any outcome. Just let the sense of recognition be what it is. There will be time later to look more closely at relationships, at work, at the ways you've learned to move through the world. For now, this first reflection is enough. Just the quiet understanding that you're not alone in feeling this way, and that what you've been experiencing makes sense within the life you've been living. As that sense of recognition continues, you may begin to notice how it shows up in the way you relate to others. Not in dramatic conflicts or obvious losses, but in quieter spaces, in conversations that feel complete on the surface, yet leave something unspoken underneath, in connections that exist, but don't quite land. Many relationships today don't end clearly. They fade.
They thin out. Messages slow. Plans stay tentative. There is rarely a moment where something is named or resolved. Instead, distance grows quietly, without explanation, leaving a sense of unfinished connection. This can happen, even when no one has done anything wrong. People move, lives change, priorities shift.
And yet, the absence of clarity often lingers longer than the connection itself. Not because you're holding on, but because part of you never had the chance to let go properly. You may notice how often connection now happens in fragments. A few messages, a short call, an update shared without depth. There is contact, but not always closeness. And over time, that pattern can create a subtle loneliness that's hard to name. This doesn't mean you lack meaningful relationships. It means the shape of connection has changed. Many people are surrounded by interaction, yet rarely feel fully met. There is presence, but not attunement. Response, but not resonance. You might recognize this in the effort it takes to stay connected, the careful timing, the unspoken rules, the sense that you have to manage how much of yourself is shown. Too much feels risky, too little feels distant, and so you hover somewhere in between. These dynamics don't usually come from indifference. They come from caution, from people learning how to stay connected without becoming overwhelmed, from lives stretched across many roles, screens, and expectations. When connection becomes conditional or fragmented, the system adapts. It learns not to expect too much, not to lean too fully, not to assume availability will last. That adaptation protects against disappointment, but it also limits depth. You may notice how this shows up in moments of vulnerability. How quickly you soften what you share. How often you reassure others before they have a chance to misunderstand. How carefully you choose what to reveal, even with people you care about. This isn't because you're guarded by nature.
It's because modern connection often lacks the spaciousness required for full presence. When time is limited and attention is divided, depth can feel like a luxury. Tonight, Var, there's no need to analyze your relationships. You don't need to decide whether they're enough or lacking. This reflection isn't asking you to change how you connect. It's simply holding up a mirror to the environment you've been navigating. As you listen, you may feel a quiet acknowledgement, a sense of recognizing patterns that felt personal, but are actually shared by many. That recognition can be relieving. It can soften the sense that something about you is uniquely disconnected. You're not failing at connection. You're responding to a culture that often moves too fast to stay deeply present. That response makes sense. For now, allow this understanding to remain gentle. You don't need to draw conclusions. You don't need to grieve what hasn't been named. Just let the recognition exist without pushing it toward meaning or resolution. There will be space later to explore closeness, distance, and the ways you've learned to navigate both. For now, this reflection is enough. Just the quiet sense that the shape of your connections has been influenced by the world around you, and that influence does not define your capacity to relate. As that awareness of connection continues, it may begin to touch another area of life that's harder to speak about openly. The moments when things appear to be going well, when the structure is in place, when responsibilities are being met, and yet something inside feels unexpectedly flat. You may recognize this feeling not as sadness, but as a lack of resonance. Life moves forward, goals are reached, tasks are completed. And still, there's a quiet question that lingers in the background, asking why satisfaction feels so brief, or why accomplishment doesn't seem to land the way you expected it to. This experience is often misunderstood. From the outside, it looks like stability. From the inside, it can feel strangely empty. Not dramatic, not overwhelming. Just a sense that the emotional return doesn't quite match the effort invested. This doesn't mean you chose the wrong path. It doesn't mean success was a mistake. It means the system adapted to pursue outcomes that were rewarded, sometimes without enough space to ask how those outcomes felt once they were reached. Many people learn early that achievement brings security, approval, options, and in many ways it does. But achievement doesn't automatically bring connection to oneself. It doesn't guarantee meaning. Those things develop in different conditions. You may notice how quickly one milestone gives way to the next. There's little time to absorb what was accomplished before attention shifts forward. The system stays oriented toward what's coming rather than what's here. Over time, that forward momentum can make presence feel secondary. In these moments, emptiness doesn't mean a lack of gratitude. You can appreciate what you have and still feel disconnected from it. Gratitude doesn't eliminate the need for resonance. It simply coexists with it. You might recognize this pattern in the way rest feels unfulfilling. Days off arrive, but don't quite restore. Time away passes quickly, without leaving a sense of renewal behind. Not because rest is wrong, but because the system hasn't been given permission to slow down long enough to feel. This experience is especially common in cultures that emphasize productivity and progress. When worth becomes linked to output, stillness can feel uncomfortable. Even leisure can start to resemble another task to complete well. You may notice how difficult it is to simply enjoy something without evaluating it, without asking whether it's worth the time, whether it's meaningful enough, whether it should feel better than it does. That evaluation subtly distances you from the experience itself.
This isn't because you're unappreciative. It's because the habit of measuring outcomes has become deeply ingrained. The mind stays active, even in moments meant for enjoyment. Tonight, there's no need to diagnose this feeling. You don't need to decide whether it's burnout, misalignment, or something else entirely. Naming it isn't required. Simply noticing it is enough. As you listen, you may find yourself recognizing moments where success felt quieter than expected, where achievement didn't bring relief, only the next expectation. That recognition doesn't need to lead anywhere.
This reflection isn't asking you to change your life. It's not suggesting you abandon what you've built. It's simply acknowledging that the inner experience of success is shaped by more than outcomes alone. For now, and allow this mirror to remain gentle. You don't need to draw conclusions. You don't need to search for meaning. Just let the sense of recognition exist, without turning it into a problem that needs solving. There will be space later to explore fulfillment, purpose and the pace at which you've been living. For now, this awareness is enough. Just the understanding that feeling empty in moments of success is not a personal failure, but a common response to the way life has been structured. As that sense of quiet emptiness settles, you may begin to notice another layer beneath it. The feeling of always needing to hold yourself together, of being the one who manages, adapts, and keeps going, even when something inside feels tired of carrying that role. Many people learn early that strength is expected, that composure is valued, that emotions are easier to accept when they're controlled, explained, or resolved quickly. Over time, this expectation becomes internalized. You stop needing reminders from the outside. You carry the standard within yourself. You may recognize this in how rarely you let yourself fully soften around others. How often you reassure before being asked. How quickly you downplay difficulty so it doesn't become an inconvenience. Strength becomes a habit, not a choice. This kind of strength is often praised. It looks like reliability, like maturity, like resilience. And in many ways it is. But it can also quietly limit where you allow yourself to rest. When you are always the steady one, it becomes harder to admit when you need support. You might notice how vulnerability feels risky, even with people you trust. Not because they would reject you, but because you're unsure how to exist without the role of being okay. When strength becomes identity, weakness can feel like a loss of self rather than a momentary state. This doesn't mean you're disconnected from your feelings. It means you've learned how to contain them. Containment can be useful. It helps you function. It helps you move through demanding situations. But when it becomes constant, it leaves little room for being held by someone else. You may notice how difficult it is to ask for help without immediately qualifying it, without explaining why it's justified, without minimizing its importance, as if needing support requires a case to be made. This pattern doesn't come from pride. It comes from adaptation, from learning that depending on others was uncertain, or that being self-sufficient reduced risk. Over time, self-sufficiency becomes default. Tonight, there's no need to challenge that identity. You don't need to stop being capable. You don't need to undo the strength you've built. This reflection isn't asking you to become different. It's simply noticing the cost of never setting that strength down. Strength, when it has no place to rest, becomes strain, not immediately. Gradually, it shows up as fatigue that doesn't resolve, as patience that thins more quickly than it used to, as a sense of being quietly worn down without a clear reason. You may recognize moments where you feel closest to others. Not when you're sharing success, but when you accidentally reveal something unpolished. A moment of honesty. A brief crack in the surface. Those moments often feel relieving because they allow the system to stop performing. This doesn't mean you need to expose everything. It means that being strong doesn't have to be constant to be real. Strength can coexist with softness. Competence can coexist with need. For now, there's no action required, no decision to make. Just the gentle acknowledgement that always being okay has required effort, and that effort has been carried quietly for a long time. As you continue listening, allow this recognition to remain without pressure. You don't need to change how you show up tomorrow. You don't need to renegotiate your role in the world. Simply noticing the weight of constant strength is enough for tonight. As that awareness of strength continues, another experience may quietly come into view. The feeling of being around others, yet not quite with them. Of participating in conversations, gatherings, and shared moments, while still carrying a sense of separation that's hard to explain. This kind of loneliness doesn't come from isolation. It can exist in busy rooms, full schedules, and constant interaction. It's not about the absence of people. It's about the absence of feeling fully seen without effort. You may recognize this in moments where you're listening more than speaking, or speaking, but choosing words carefully so they land safely. You're present, but part of you stays slightly behind, observing, adjusting, maintaining. Being with others can start to feel like a performance, even when the performance is subtle. Not pretending to be someone else, but staying within a range that feels acceptable. Too much honesty feels risky. Too much quiet feels noticeable. And so you stay balanced, but not fully at rest. This experience doesn't mean you lack close relationships. Many people who feel this way are deeply caring, attentive, and reliable. They show up, they listen, they support, but they rarely feel supported in the same way. Not because others don't care, but because the space to receive doesn't always feel available. You may notice how difficult it is to let yourself be held in conversation, to speak without editing, to pause without filling the silence, to allow uncertainty to exist without smoothing it over. These moments require a level of safety that modern connection doesn't always provide. Loneliness, in this sense, is not about being unwanted. It's about being unseen in the places where effort is required to belong. Over time, that effort becomes invisible, even to yourself. You just feel tired after social interaction, without knowing exactly why. This isn't because you're introverted or extroverted. It's because connection often happens at a pace that doesn't leave room for attunement. People move quickly, attention shifts, depth becomes optional. You may notice how rarely you're asked questions that invite you to slow down. How often conversations stay practical, efficient, surface level, not out of disinterest, but out of habit. Life moves fast, and connection adjusts accordingly. Tonight, there's no need to label this feeling or trace it back to specific relationships. You don't need to decide whether it means something is missing. This reflection is not asking you to fix your social life or seek different connections. It's simply acknowledging that feeling alone while surrounded by others is a common response to the way connection has been shaped, and that response makes sense. As you listen,
You may recognize moments where you felt most at ease, not when you were understood perfectly, but when you didn't have to explain yourself at all. When presence was enough and words were secondary. That kind of connection is rare, not because people don't want it, but because it requires time, attention, and mutual slowing. Conditions that are often scarce. For now, let this recognition remain gentle. You don't need to draw conclusions. You don't need to decide what kind of connection you want more of. Just allow the feeling to be named quietly, without turning it into a problem. As the night continues, you can let the sense of loneliness soften without being resolved. It doesn't need an answer to be acknowledged. Sometimes, being recognized is enough to reduce its weight, as that quiet sense of loneliness softens. Another familiar weight may come into focus. The effort it takes to appear okay. Not cheerful, not perfect, just functional enough to move through the day without drawing concern. You may recognize how often you answer questions with a version of fine. Not because you're hiding something dramatic, but because explaining how you actually feel
Would take more energy than you have. It's easier to say you're okay than to translate the complexity underneath. Being okay becomes a role, one that keeps things smooth, one that avoids burdening others, one that signals reliability. Over time, that role can feel necessary, even when it's exhausting. You might notice how rarely you allow yourself to be unsure in public, how quickly you smooth over doubt, how instinctively you present solutions rather than questions. This doesn't come from dishonesty. It comes from adaptation. In many environments, uncertainty feels inconvenient. Slowness feels inefficient. Emotional nuance feels hard to place. And so you learn to compress your experience into something manageable. Something that fits. That compression requires effort. It means holding parts of yourself just out of view. Not rejecting them, but postponing them. Telling yourself you'll deal with them later, when there's more time, more space, more capacity. Later doesn't always come. Over time, this pattern can create a quiet fatigue that doesn't respond to rest. Sleep helps, but doesn't fully restore. Breaks provide relief, but don't reach the deeper tiredness underneath. Because what's tiring isn't just activity, it's the ongoing effort to maintain coherence. You may notice how this shows up as irritability without a clear cause, as a low-level weariness that follows you even on good days, as a sense that you're always slightly behind your own experience. This doesn't mean something is wrong with you.
It means you've been carrying more than you let on, even to yourself. Being okay takes work when okay isn't actually how you feel. There is often an unspoken rule that you shouldn't fall apart unless there's a clear reason. A loss, a crisis, something visible. But many forms of exhaustion don't come from singular events. They come from accumulation, from being consistently capable, consistently available, consistently composed. You may notice how hard it is to let go of this role, even in moments of privacy. How the internal pressure to stay functional continues, even when no one is watching. That pressure didn't appear randomly, it was learned. Tonight, there's no need to drop the role entirely. You don't need to admit anything. You don't need to change how you present yourself tomorrow. This reflection isn't asking for disruption. It's simply acknowledging the effort behind being okay. Naming the quiet work that often goes unseen. Recognition alone can reduce the load. As you listen, allow yourself to imagine what it would feel like to not have to maintain coherence for a moment. Not to fall apart but to stop holding everything together. Even a brief release can be enough to soften the system. You don't need to explain this tiredness. You don't need to justify it. And you don't need to fix it tonight. Just letting it be recognized, without pressure to resolve, is enough for now. As all of these reflections sit quietly together, there's no need to arrange them into a story. Nothing here needs to be connected or explained. These are not pieces of a problem. They are simply experiences that have been named softly, without being pushed toward a conclusion. You may notice a sense of recognition rather than clarity. A feeling that something you've been carrying has been seen, even if it hasn't been resolved. That kind of recognition doesn't demand action. It doesn't ask for change. It simply reduces the effort of holding everything alone. Not everything that's noticed needs to be worked on. Some things only need to be acknowledged to lose their sharpness. When experience is allowed to exist without being judged or fixed, it often settles on its own. You don't need to take inventory of what resonated most. You don't need to decide which parts apply to you. The system understands relevance without analysis. It absorbs what fits and lets the rest pass without instruction. There is a tendency to turn recognition into responsibility. To feel that once something is seen, it must be addressed. Tonight, that tendency can rest. Awareness does not require response. Seeing does not require doing. Life will continue tomorrow much as it did today. Roles will return. Expectations will still exist.
Nothing here is asking you to step out of your life or reconfigure it. This moment is not a turning point, it's a pause. And pauses don't need to justify themselves. If you feel a slight easing, allow it. If you feel nothing in particular, that's fine too. Not every reflection produces an immediate shift.
Some simply create a little more space around what was already there. You may notice that the urge to understand has softened, or that the need to explain yourself feels less urgent. These are not outcomes to pursue. They're side effects of reduced pressure. For now, let all of this remain unfinished. There's no reason to close the loop. Life rarely offers clean conclusions, and rest does not depend on them. As you continue listening, you can allow the reflections to fade into the background, like sounds that gradually blend into the quiet. The system will keep what it needs without effort. There will be time later to engage,
To question, to change if change becomes necessary. But tonight does not ask for any of that. Tonight only asks for permission to let things be as they are, without demand. Let this sense of allowance remain gentle and open, not something to hold on to. Just something that is available in this moment. And as the night continues,
you don't need to do anything with what has been recognized. You can let it rest, exactly as it is, without needing it to become more than that. As the reflections from earlier parts begin to settle, you may notice that the mind is still quietly active in one familiar way. It looks for reasons. It asks questions. It tries to trace causes and effects, hoping that understanding will bring relief. This is not a mistake. The question why has been useful for much of your life. It helped you make sense of uncertainty. It gave structure to confusion. It offered the promise that if you could understand enough, things would feel lighter. But at night, this same question often does the opposite. Instead of calming the system, it keeps it alert.
Instead of bringing clarity, it keeps the mind moving in circles. The search for explanation becomes another form of effort. You may recognize how easily the question appears when things slow down. Why did this happen? Why did it affect me this way? Why am I still thinking about it? Why can't I move on? These questions don't arrive loudly. They slip in quietly, dressed as curiosity, but they carry tension with them. The nervous system doesn't rest while it's searching for answers. Even gentle inquiry keeps it oriented toward resolution, toward fixing, toward arriving somewhere else than here. Tonight, nothing is asking to be resolved. It's important to understand that letting go of why is not giving up on meaning.
It's recognizing that meaning does not always arrive on demand. Some experiences don't offer immediate explanations, and pushing for them can keep the body in a state of readiness. You don't need to stop the question when it appears. That would require effort. Instead, you can allow it to exist without following it.
The question can be present without becoming a task. Notice how the body responds when you stop trying to answer. There may be a small release, a subtle shift, not because the question disappeared, but because you're no longer chasing it. The mind often believes that understanding is required for rest, that once things make sense, the system can finally relax. But many people discover the opposite at night. That rest allows understanding to come later, if it comes at all. There are experiences that only soften when they're no longer being analyzed. Not because they lack meaning, but because meaning unfolds on a different timeline than the mind prefers. You don't need to know tonight why something still lingers. You don't need to know why certain feelings return. You don't need to know why some questions haven't found answers yet. None of that information is required for rest. If the question why arises again as you listen, see if you can let it pass like a sound in the distance. You don't need to respond. You don't need to finish the thought. You can remain where you are. This is not avoidance. Avoidance pushes away. This is allowing the question to exist without engagement. There is a difference. For many people, why has been tied to self-evaluation. Why am I like this? Why can't I handle this better? Why does this still bother me? These versions of the question quietly turn experience into judgment. Letting go of why is also letting go of that judgment, even briefly. It creates a small space where experience is no longer being interrogated. You may notice resistance to this idea, a sense that if you don't understand, something important will be missed. That concern is familiar. It learned its role carefully. It doesn't need to be argued with. It only needs reassurance that rest does not erase insight. For now, allow the mind to rest from its search. Not permanently, just for this moment. Answers can wait. Explanations can wait. The system does not need them to slow down. As this part of the night continues, let the question loosen its grip. You don't need to drop it entirely. Just let it sit unanswered, without tension, without urgency. There will be time later for reflection, for understanding, for meaning. Tonight is not that time. Tonight is for allowing the body to experience what happens when it is no longer required to know.
As the question loosens slightly, you may begin to notice another way it has been operating. Not just as curiosity, but as pressure. A quiet demand placed on yourself to arrive at an explanation before you're allowed to feel at ease. For many people, the question why becomes personal. It turns inward. Why am I reacting this way?
Why can't I let this go? Why does this still matter to me? These questions often sound reasonable, even responsible. But beneath them, there is a subtle message that something about your experience needs justification. When the mind frames experience this way, rest is delayed. The system remains on standby, waiting for clarity that may never arrive. The search itself becomes tiring, even when the questions feel calm on the surface. This is not because asking why is wrong. It's because, over time, the question can become a way of monitoring yourself, measuring progress, evaluating whether you're responding correctly to your own life. At night, this kind of monitoring keeps the nervous system alert. It signals that something is unresolved, something still requires attention, and the body responds by staying slightly braced, even when there is no immediate task. You may notice how easily why turns into self-judgment. Why am I not over this yet? Why does this bother me more than it should? Why can others handle this better? These versions of the question quietly compare your inner world to an imagined standard. That comparison rarely brings relief. It usually adds another layer of tension. Not only is something uncomfortable, but now it feels incorrect. Letting go of why here means releasing the idea that your experience needs to meet a certain benchmark to be valid. Feelings do not require explanation to exist. Reactions do not need to be justified before they're allowed. This does not mean giving up responsibility or awareness. It means recognizing that some forms of understanding are better approached when the system is rested, not when it's exhausted. You may notice a part of you that resists this, a concern that if you don't examine things closely, patterns will repeat, that mistakes will be missed, that something important will slip by. This concern has a history. It learned to associate vigilance with safety. There is no need to dismiss that concern. You can acknowledge it without obeying it. The mind can be active without being in charge. For now, allow yourself to step out of self-evaluation. Not permanently, just for this moment. You don't need to assess how you're doing. You don't need to determine whether you're healing correctly. You don't need to check your progress. Notice how the body responds when it's no longer being graded. There may be a small sense of relief, or simply less tightness around the chest or shoulders. These are not things to look for. They happen naturally when pressure decreases. You don't need to answer the question of why you are the way you are tonight. That question can wait. It does not hold the key to rest. Some understanding only becomes available when the mind stops demanding it, when attention softens, when effort drops low enough for the system to reorganize on its own. As you continue listening, if self-questioning appears again, see if you can recognize it as habit rather than necessity. You don't need to complete the thought. You don't need to follow it to its conclusion. This is not avoidance. It is timing. And tonight, the timing favors rest over explanation. Allow the questions to remain unanswered without turning that into a problem. Unanswered does not mean unresolved. It simply means not required right now. For the remainder of this moment, let the system experience what it's like to exist without being analyzed, without being compared, without being asked to make sense. That experience alone can begin to ease the effort you've been carrying. As the pressure to explain begins to ease, you may notice a quieter shift taking place. When the question why is no longer driving your attention, something else becomes possible. Experience can exist without needing to be translated into meaning right away. Much of life is lived without explanation.
The body knows how to breathe without understanding oxygen. The heart beats without
Asking for a reason. Yet the mind often insists that emotional experience must be clarified before it can be accepted. This insistence is learned. In many environments, explanation brings safety. Understanding brings predictability. And predictability feels like control. But control is not the same as peace. At night,
when the system is tired, the demand for explanation can become a burden. The mind keeps returning to the same questions, hoping repetition will produce an answer. But repetition often only reinforces effort. You may notice how different it feels when you stop trying to explain your experience to yourself. When you don't ask what it means, or where it came from, or how long it will last. There is a simplicity in allowing sensation, emotion, or thought to pass through without commentary. This is not disengagement. It's a different form of presence. One that does not require interpretation to remain aware. Life does not always arrive with instructions. Many moments do not offer immediate insight. Trying to force explanation in those moments can keep the nervous system active, even when nothing is required. You don't need to understand tonight why certain feelings arise. You don't need to connect them to a story. You don't need to place them on a timeline. Allowing them to exist without explanation is enough. If the mind reaches again for meaning, notice that movement gently. You don't need to follow it. Meaning is not lost when it is postponed. It often becomes clearer when effort subsides. There are experiences that unfold only when they are not being watched too closely. Like sleep itself. The more you try to understand it, the farther away it seems. The body enters rest when it is no longer being managed. Allowing life without explanation, even briefly, gives the system permission to settle. Not because everything is resolved,
but because nothing is being demanded. You may feel a slight uncertainty here. A sense of floating without answers. That feeling is natural. It's what happens when the mind releases its usual grip. It does not need to be corrected. Uncertainty does not mean danger. It simply means openness. And openness
at night can be restful when it's not framed as a problem. You are not abandoning meaning. You are giving it space to arrive later, in its own way, if it needs to. Some understanding comes through living, not through thinking. For now, let experience be incomplete. Let feelings be unexamined. Let questions remain unanswered. None of this prevents growth. It simply allows the system to rest from the effort of making sense. As you continue listening, allow this permission to remain in the background. You don't need to hold on to it. Just let it be available. A quiet option to not explain, not interpret, not resolve. Tonight, that is enough. As the need for explanation continues to loosen, another shift becomes possible. Rest no longer has to wait for answers. The body does not require clarity to slow down. It only needs permission to stop searching. Many people believe that rest comes after understanding. That once things make sense, the system will finally relax. But the body often follows a different order. It settles first. Understanding, if it comes at all, arrives later. At night, the demand for answers can quietly keep the system awake. The mind holds itself in readiness, waiting for a conclusion that signals it's safe to let go. But safety does not always arrive through explanation. Sometimes it arrives through stillness. You may notice how the body responds when it realizes it doesn't have to solve anything. The breath deepens slightly. Muscles release just a bit. The constant internal scanning eases. These changes are subtle, but they are meaningful. Rest without answers does not mean neglecting what matters. It means trusting that what matters will still be there tomorrow, even if it remains unclear tonight. Life does not disappear when questions are set down. If the mind reaches again for resolution, see if you can allow it to rest beside the unanswered question. You don't need to close the loop. You don't need to finish the thought. The system can remain at ease even with open ends.
There is a difference between uncertainty and instability. Uncertainty is simply not knowing. Instability is threat. At night, a not knowing does not have to be threatening. It can be neutral. It can be quiet. You may feel an urge to check in with your thoughts, to see whether something has shifted yet. Notice that urge gently.
Monitoring itself requires effort, and effort keeps the system awake. Instead, allow yourself to rest without evaluation. You don't need to confirm that this is working. The body does not need proof to relax. There are moments when rest feels undeserved if nothing has been resolved. As if you should stay alert until understanding arrives. That belief is learned. It does not need to be followed. You are allowed to rest even when things don't make sense. You are allowed to rest even when questions remain open. Rest is not a reward for clarity. It is a condition that allows clarity to emerge later.
As you continue listening, notice how the absence of pressure changes the quality of the moment. There is less urgency, less drive to arrive somewhere else. Just the simple experience of being here without demand. You don't need to remember any of this. You don't need to hold on to the idea. The nervous system responds to conditions, not concepts. And right now, the condition is one of lowered demand. If sleep begins to approach, allow it. If it doesn't, allow that too. Rest is not measured by outcome. It is felt in the reduction of effort. For now, let unanswered questions remain unanswered. Let understanding wait. Let the system experience what it's like to slow down without conditions attached. Tonight, that is enough. As the questions begin to lose their urgency, you may notice that they no longer ask for attention in the same way. They don't disappear completely. They simply soften. Their edges blur. And in that softening, effort begins to drop. You don't need to push the question away. You don't need to answer it. You can allow it to remain unanswered without holding it tightly. Like something set down nearby, no longer carried. The mind often believes that unanswered questions create tension. But tension usually comes from the effort to resolve them, not from their existence. When the effort stops, the question can remain without weight. Notice how different it feels when you no longer lean toward explanation,
when you don't move toward a conclusion. There is more space around experience, less urgency to define it. This is not indifference. It's not resignation. It's a temporary release from the habit of needing to know. A recognition that knowing is not required right now. You may feel moments where attention drifts completely, where the words lose clarity, where the sense of listening becomes vague. This is not something to correct. It's a sign that the system is no longer organizing itself around understanding. Let the question dissolve at its own pace, not forced, not rushed, just allowed to fade into the background. Like sound becoming quieter without being silenced. You don't need to remember what you were questioning. You don't need to hold on to the topic. The nervous system does not need content to rest. It needs a reduction in demand.
As effort continues to drop, you may notice a sense of simplicity, fewer internal movements, less checking, less reaching.
This simplicity is not emptiness. It's rest without agenda. There is no need to replace the question with an answer. No need to substitute explanation with reassurance. The absence of pressure is enough. If thoughts continue to arise, let them arise. If they fade, let them fade. Nothing here requires participation. You can remain present without engagement. The system knows how to move toward rest when it is no longer being directed. It does not need guidance. It does not need instruction. It only needs space. Allow this space to remain open, unclaimed, undefined. You don't need to do anything with it. As the night continues, you can let go of the need to understand this process as well. Understanding is another form of effort, and effort is no longer required. For now, let the question be gone, not because it was answered, but because it is no longer needed. Let it dissolve into the quiet, without ceremony, without closure. And as this quiet deepens, you don't need to follow what comes next. You can remain where you are, supported by the absence of demand, as the night carries you forward. As the effort to understand has faded, there is nothing left to hold in place. The night does not ask you to arrive anywhere. It does not ask you to do anything differently. It simply offers a steady, quiet space where nothing needs to be maintained. You don't need to change your position. You don't need to adjust your breathing. Whatever is happening in your body right now is already enough.
The system knows how to settle when it is no longer being directed. Notice that you are here, supported, without needing to stay alert. The surface beneath you is doing the work of holding. Gravity is doing the work of grounding. You don't need to assist either of them. If thoughts continue to move, allow them to move.
If they slow, allow that too. There is no correct pace for the mind tonight. The night does not measure progress. You may notice that attention no longer needs to stay sharp. It can soften at the edges. Words can come and go without being followed. Listening does not require focus. It only requires permission to remain passive. Nothing in this moment needs to be improved. Nothing needs to be understood. You are not preparing for what comes next. You are not reviewing what came before. You are simply allowing the body to remain where it is, without expectation. If there is a sense of heaviness, let it be there. If there is lightness, let that be there too. Sensation does not need interpretation. It does not need direction. It can exist on its own. The night moves at a different pace than the day. It does not rush. It does not compare. It does not demand coherence. It allows things to be unfinished. You don't need to stay with every sentence. You don't need to remember what was said a moment ago. The meaning is not in the words. It is in the absence of urgency around them. As you continue listening, allow yourself to be less involved, less engaged, less responsible for the experience. You can let the voice remain in the background, like sound blending into quiet. There is nothing you need to check, nothing you need to confirm. The system does not need reassurance to slow down. It only needs the absence of demand. For now, let the night hold this moment. Let it remain simple, unclaimed, unmanaged. Just the steady continuation of quiet, without direction, without effort, as the night continues to hold you. There is no need to keep the body upright or prepared. It does not have to stay light or responsive. it can begin to feel its own weight without doing anything about it. You don't need to move toward relaxation. You don't need to release anything on purpose. The body already knows how to settle when it is no longer being asked to stay ready.
If there is a sense of heaviness, allow it. If there is none, allow that too. Nothing needs to change for this moment to be complete. Wait does not need permission. It arrives when effort steps aside. Notice how the body rests when it is not being organized, not scanned, not adjusted, just allowed to be where it is, without instruction. You may feel certain areas become more present or less noticeable. Both are fine. Sensation can shift without meaning. It does not need interpretation to continue. There is no need to check whether you are relaxed enough. That kind of checking brings effort back. Tonight, effort can remain low. The body does not need to meet a condition to rest. If thoughts appear, let them pass without following them into the body. You don't need to connect sensations to ideas. The body and mind can move independently for a while. Allow the sense of gravity to do its work. You don't need to assist it. You don't need to deepen it. You can simply stop resisting it. If the body feels still, let it be still. If it shifts slightly, let it shift. Movement does not interrupt rest. Control does. As attention softens, you may notice that the edges of awareness blur. That is not something to correct. It is a sign that the system is no longer maintaining sharpness. You do not need to remain aware of the body. You do not need to keep track of where sensation is strongest. Awareness can loosen. The body will continue to rest without supervision. For now, allow the body to be heavy in its own way. Not as an exercise, not as a technique, just as a natural response to the absence of demand. Let the voice remain in the background. Let sensation remain unexamined. Let the night continue without direction. As the body settles in its own way, the mind does not need to follow a plan. Thoughts may still appear. They may come and go, change shape, or lose clarity. None of that requires attention. You don't need to stop thinking. You don't need to guide the mind toward quiet. Thinking can continue without participation. Thoughts can move without being carried. Notice how different it feels when you don't follow a thought to its end, when you don't complete the sentence in your head, when you don't ask where it leads. There is less effort when the mind is allowed to remain unfinished. Thoughts can be present without becoming tasks. They can pass like sounds in another room, heard but not engaged, existing but not directing anything. If a thought draws your attention for a moment, that's fine. You don't need to pull away from it. You can simply let it fade on its own, without pushing, without deciding what it means. The mind has its own rhythm at night. It slows not because it is told to, but because there is no reason to stay alert. When nothing is required, thinking naturally becomes less organized. You may notice gaps between thoughts, small spaces where nothing in particular is happening. These spaces don't need to be filled. They don't need to be noticed. They can remain quiet without being claimed. If thoughts repeat, allow the repetition. Repetition loses energy when it is not followed. The mind tires of its own loops when there is no response. You don't need to replace thoughts with anything else. Silence does not need to be created. Quiet often arrives when effort leaves. As attention continues to soften, the boundary between listening and not listening may blur. Words may become indistinct. Meaning may feel less important than sound. That shift does not require correction. You are not meant to stay aware of everything that happens in the mind. Awareness can drift too. It can move in and out without being held in place. For now, let thoughts remain free to come and go. Let them drift without direction. You don't need to manage them. You don't need to monitor them. They can exist without involvement. Allow the night to continue in this way. Unstructured, undirected, quietly unfolding without effort, as thoughts continue to drift on their own. There is no need to guide where this moment goes next. The night does not require direction. It unfolds without instruction, without intention, without a destination. You don't need to move towards sleep. You don't need to stay awake. You don't need to aim for anything at all. Whatever happens next can happen without your involvement.
Notice how different it feels when there is nowhere to go. When the sense of forward movement softens, when the idea of progress is no longer relevant. The system relaxes when it is no longer oriented toward an outcome. There may be a habit of checking in, of asking what comes next, of anticipating the next step. That habit can rest now. Nothing is waiting. Nothing is expected. If awareness drifts, let it drift. If it returns, let it return. Neither movement needs attention. There is no correct state to remain in. You don't need to follow the voice. You don't need to stay with the words. Sound can exist without meaning. Meaning can fade without loss. As direction dissolves, time may feel less defined. Minutes do not need to be counted. Moments do not need to be marked. The night does not keep track. There is relief in not having to arrive anywhere, in not needing this experience to become something else. Just being here is enough, without reference to before or after. If the mind looks for orientation, you can let it look without responding. Direction is not required for rest. The body does not need a plan to slow down. Allow yourself to remain without purpose for a while. Not because purpose is unimportant, but because it is not needed right now. This moment is not asking for meaning. As effort continues to drop, the sense of self may feel less defined. Not gone, just less outlined. That softening does not need to be understood. You don't need to hold this state. You don't need to maintain it. Direction returns on its own when it's needed. For now, it can remain absent. Let the night carry what comes next. You do not need to lead. You do not need to follow. You can remain where you are, without orientation, without expectation. As everything continues on its own, as direction has softened, awareness itself no longer needs to stay in place. You don't need to remain present. You don't need to know what is happening. Awareness can fade without being lost. There is a common belief that you must stay aware in order to rest. But rest does not depend on attention. The body knows how to enter it without supervision. Sleep does not require permission. If you notice awareness slipping, allow it. If it returns briefly, allow that too. Neither movement needs to be followed. The system can move in and out of awareness without effort. You don't need to track the moment when rest becomes sleep. You don't need to notice the transition. The body will cross that threshold on its own when conditions are quiet enough. Sound can become distant. Words can lose their edges. Meaning can dissolve without consequence.
Nothing important is being missed. You are not required to stay with the voice. It can remain as background, like a steady presence that does not ask for response. Listening can continue without recognition. If there is a sense of drifting, let it drift. If there is a pause where nothing registers, let that pause remain. These are natural movements when effort has dropped low. Awareness does not need to be held together. It does not need to be continuous.
Gaps are allowed. Gaps are restful. There is no need to remind yourself to relax. There is no need to confirm that you are resting. Checking reintroduces effort, and effort is no longer necessary. As the night continues, you may not remember everything that was said. You may not remember anything at all. Memory is not required for rest. You can let go of the task of listening. You can let go of the task of being here. The body can remain while awareness drifts elsewhere. For now, allow rest to happen without you. Allow it to arrive without announcement,
Without clarity, without recognition. Nothing needs to be carried forward from this moment. Nothing needs to be understood. You can remain where you are, or fade gently away from it, as the night continues in its own time. As awareness continues to thin, the voice does not need to stay in the foreground. It can move to the edges, becoming part of the quiet rather than something to attend to. You don't need to listen closely. You don't need to follow along. Sound can exist without engagement. There is no need to stay with the words. They can pass without landing. You can allow them to blur,
to soften, to become indistinct. Meaning is no longer required. If the voice fades from notice, let it fade. If it returns briefly, let it return. Neither movement asks for response. The night does not require participation. You may notice moments where there is no clear sense of listening at all. Gaps where nothing registers.
These gaps are not interruptions. They are signs that effort has dropped low enough for rest to deepen. The body can remain settled while attention moves elsewhere. You don't need to bring awareness back. You don't need to hold anything in place. Stability does not depend on attention. Sound can become texture, a steady presence without form, like distant noise that does not call for recognition. The voice can remain without needing to be heard. If thoughts appear, they can pass behind the sound. If sensation appears, it can remain without notice. Everything can coexist without hierarchy. There is no need to decide whether you are awake or asleep.
Labels are unnecessary. The system moves naturally when it is no longer being observed. As the night continues, the background can remain the background. Nothing needs to come forward. Nothing needs to stand out. The experience does not need to be clear. You don't need to stay connected to this moment. Connection can loosen.
The body can continue on its own without supervision. For now, let the voice stay where it is, distant, unimportant, part of the quiet rather than separate from it. Let the night continue without direction, without engagement, without effort, as everything continues on its own. There is no need to bring this moment to a close. The night does not require an ending. It does not need a signal that something is complete. It simply continues quietly, without marking transitions. You don't need to notice what happens next. You don't need to stay with the sound. You don't need to remain aware of anything at all.
The system can move forward without acknowledgement. If awareness has already faded, there is nothing to return to. If it drifts in and out, that movement does not need attention. Nothing here depends on continuity. The voice can remain, or it can disappear from notice. Either way is fine. The night does not depend on words to carry it forward.
There is no message to remember, no meaning to hold on to, no instruction to follow. What matters now does not need language. You may find that there is no clear boundary between listening and not listening, between being here and not being here. That absence of boundary does not need to be named. Everything can remain unfinished, open, unclaimed. The night does not require resolution. If sleep has arrived, let it continue. If it has not, let that be unchanged. There is no urgency either way. Nothing is being concluded. Nothing is being closed. The experience does not need to become anything else. As the night carries on, you are not required to stay with this moment. You are not required to leave it either. Everything can continue exactly as it is, without effort, without direction, without end. So